There's a detail you've probably walked past 1,000 times without really seeing it. A window that sits half underground, a doorway that opens straight into concrete, a building that feels wrong, like it's sunk into the earth instead of standing on it. Most people never question it. You're told it's normal. Cities rise. Streets get raised. That's just how history works. But here's the uncomfortable thought. What if that explanation only exists because the real one is too disturbing to say out loud? By the end of this video, you're going to see why the 19th century may not have been a quiet age of progress and industry at all, but the aftermath of something far more violent. Not a war, not a recession, but a global catastrophe so disruptive that entire cities had to be dug back into existence. And I'm not asking you to believe a theory. I'm asking you to look at the physical evidence that still exists, hiding in plain sight beneath your feet. Here's the thing most people don't realize. History isn't written where events happen. It's written after, by the people who survive, using whatever fragments remain. And when something happens that breaks the normal flow of civilization, the story doesn't get told directly. It gets softened, renamed, reframed, because societies don't like admitting they were powerless. They prefer words like regrading, urban improvement, redevelopment, words that sound intentional, controlled, rational. But when you strip those words away and look at the raw images, a very different picture starts to emerge. Let's start with the simplest question, the one nobody ever asks out loud. How do entire floors of solid stone buildings end up underground? Not cracked, not destroyed, not collapsed, buried. Windows intact, walls straight, masonry undisturbed. We're not talking about mudslides that knock houses over or earthquakes that reduce them to rubble. We're talking about buildings that appear to have been gently lowered into the earth, like artifacts placed into storage by time itself. Old photographs from the mid to late 1800s show this happening across multiple American cities. Not just one, not just along a river, not just in flood-prone areas. We see it in port cities, inland cities, high-elevation cities, places separated by thousands of miles in completely different geographies. And the depth is what makes this impossible to ignore. 5 feet would be strange, 10 feet would be shocking. But in some cases, we see 20 feet or more of soil pressed directly against finished stone facades. That's not sediment, that's not gradual buildup, that's a volume of material that had to arrive all at once, or at least over a very short period of time. Now pause for a second and think about what that means. If that much earth suddenly appears in a city, it doesn't just inconvenience people. It ends civilization there. Streets vanish, drainage fails, commerce stops, buildings become unusable. If this happened slowly over centuries, people would adapt. They'd raise doorways, build steps, change layouts, but that's not what we see. What we see instead is something far more telling. We see massive efforts to dig everything back out, to restore an earlier ground level as if that level was sacred, non-negotiable, essential for survival. And that leads us to the next question. Who dug these cities out and how? This is where the story gets truly surreal. Because the same photographs that show buried buildings also show the excavation process itself. And it wasn't small, it wasn't casual, it wasn't a few men with shovels fixing a street corner, it was industrial warfare against the ground. Steam shovels the size of houses, temporary railroads laid directly through city streets, entire trains dedicated to hauling earth away non-stop. Conveyor systems stretching across neighborhoods. This wasn't maintenance, this was emergency-scale earth removal. Think about the logistics for a moment. Millions of cubic yards of material had to be removed without collapsing the buildings they were pressed against. That requires planning, engineering, coordination, and above all, urgency. You don't mobilize this level of effort unless the alternative is unacceptable. And yet when you look for the reason in official records, you find something almost absurdly understated. Street regrading, terrain improvement, modernization. Let's focus on one city first, because it's often used as the textbook example, Seattle. Early photographs of Seattle don't look like a growing city. They look like a disaster zone frozen in time. You see solid brick buildings standing at the base of sheer vertical walls of earth. Not slopes, not hills, walls. flat-topped, compacted masses of soil rising like artificial cliffs between streets. In some images, houses sit on top of these earthen blocks, isolated like islands that were sliced out of a larger landmass. In others, buildings tilt at unnatural angles, as if the ground beneath them was removed before they were ready to stand on their own. This isn't what urban planning looks like. This is what excavation after burial looks like. Officially, Seattle's explanation is simple. The city had inconvenient hills. Those hills were leveled. Streets were raised to prevent flooding. Everything was done deliberately, step by step, as part of progress. But this explanation starts to collapse the moment you compare it to what the photographs actually show, because leveling hills does not result in finished stone buildings being buried up to their second floors. Leveling removes material, it doesn't mysteriously add it, and then there's the method used to remove this soil, which raises even more questions. Alongside steam shovels and trains, we see something else used extensively. High-pressure water jets, not sprinklers, not hoses for dust control. These are powerful streams directed straight at vertical walls of compacted earth, turning them into flowing mud. In many cases, water appears to be the primary tool, not a supplement. This should immediately strike you as odd. Turning soil into slurry makes excavation harder, not easier. Mud is heavier, messier, and more difficult to transport than dry earth, unless the material you're dealing with can't be broken apart efficiently any other way. Unless it's frozen, cemented, bound together in a way that resists mechanical digging. Now here's where a single phrase buried in official documents becomes impossible to ignore. The soil formations removed during Seattle's regrading projects were referred to as glacial hills. On the surface, that sounds like a harmless geological description. But think about what that word actually means. Glacial material is compacted, water-rich, and often frozen or semi-frozen. It behaves very differently from ordinary soil, and suddenly the water jets make sense, because this exact method was used elsewhere at the same time for a very specific purpose. In Alaska, during the gold rush, miners faced thick layers of frozen ground known as muck. This wasn't ordinary dirt. It was a solid mass of ice, soil, organic matter, and debris, frozen together into something closer to rock than earth. Digging it mechanically was nearly impossible. So they used hydraulic monitors, high-pressure water cannons that melted and washed the frozen ground away. The process was identical. Same equipment, same technique, same result. So now we're forced to ask an uncomfortable question. Why was a coastal city at a temperate latitude dealing with ground that behaved like permafrost? Seattle is not supposed to have frozen subsurface layers like that. Its climate doesn't support it, not now, and according to mainstream climatology, not in the recent past either, unless what they were dealing with wasn't ancient permafrost formed over thousands of years, but something much younger. Something deposited suddenly. Something that froze in place because of its composition and the conditions at the time. This leads to a hypothesis that sounds insane at first, but starts to connect dots with disturbing efficiency. What if Seattle wasn't slowly built on glacial terrain, but was buried by a catastrophic event involving massive quantities of ice, mud, and debris? Not a gentle flood, not a normal tsunami, but a moving wall of slurry that slammed into the coastline, overwhelmed the landscape, and then froze. Imagine a wave not just of water, but of pulverized ice, sediment, and organic matter scraped from the ocean floor. Imagine it surging inland, burying everything in its path, then locking into place as temperatures dropped. What remains afterward wouldn't look like flood damage. It would look like the land itself had risen around existing structures. It would look exactly like what we see in those photographs, and crucially, it would explain why the material had to be washed away instead of dug. It wasn't soil, it was frozen catastrophe. This theory explains Seattle with terrifying elegance, the sudden appearance of massive volumes of earth, the strange removal methods, the decision to dump the material back into the sea, even the terminology used to describe it. But just as this explanation starts to feel convincing, it hits a wall. A wall called geography, because Seattle is not alone. Let's move to a city that completely destroys the idea of a single coastal disaster. Kansas City. Kansas City sits deep in the interior of North America, nearly 900 feet above sea level, thousands of miles from any ocean. There is no conceivable tsunami scenario, ice-based or otherwise, that could reach it without obliterating half the continent first. And yet, the photographic evidence there is even more extreme. One image shows a massive stone building buried almost to its roof. Not blocked, not damaged, buried. Another photograph from the 1860s shows soil pressed against a building to the height of 2 full high-ceiling floors, roughly 23 feet. That is not erosion. That is not landscaping. That is a geological event. And unlike Seattle, the terrain around these buildings tells a different story. The soil appears loose, undulating, shaped like frozen waves or dunes. There's no sign of water flow patterns, no scouring, no collapse marks, just accumulation. Layer upon layer of material that looks like it was dropped from the sky or pushed by wind, not delivered by water. Even more telling is what's missing. Mature trees, old-growth forests, vegetation that should have been present if the land had been stable for centuries. Instead, we see young saplings at best, suggesting the surface itself was new, recently exposed, recently settled. This forces us to abandon the idea of a single mechanism. Whatever buried Seattle could not have buried Kansas City, and whatever buried Kansas City could not have come from the ocean, which means we're not looking at one disaster, we're looking at multiple manifestations of something far larger. And this is where the investigation takes a darker turn. Because when different regions experience radically different catastrophes at roughly the same time, the cause is rarely local, it's systemic. In the central regions of the continent, water isn't the dominant force. Air is, wind, dust. We know from modern history that wind alone can reshape entire landscapes. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s stripped fertile soil from millions of acres and carried it across states. Cities were choked by dust. Crops failed. People fled. And that event was triggered by agricultural mismanagement combined with drought, not by some apocalyptic anomaly. So what would happen if a much larger disruption occurred? One that destabilized climate patterns, stripped moisture from land, killed vegetation, and unleashed continuous massive dust storms for years? Not a single storm, but a sequence, a sustained assault. Sand doesn't need to hit you to bury you. It only needs time. Grain by grain, driven by relentless wind, it piles up against structures. It fills streets, it climbs walls, it pours through windows, and unlike water, it doesn't retreat. It stays, it accumulates, and crucially, it preserves what it covers. Buildings buried by sand aren't smashed, they're entombed. Suddenly, the preservation of Kansas City's structures makes sense. There was no impact, no violent collision, just engulfment. And now, with that realization, we're left staring at a far more disturbing picture. Coastal regions overwhelmed by ice-laden slurry. Interior regions smothered by airborne earth. Different mechanisms, same outcome. Cities buried. Civilization interrupted. History quietly rebooted. Which raises the most important question of all. What kind of global event could trigger such radically different disasters at the same time? Because this no longer looks like coincidence. It looks like a planetary system breaking down. If a catastrophe powerful enough to bury cities really did occur, then the most disturbing mystery isn't the soil, the ice, or the sand, it's the silence. Because events of that magnitude don't just disappear. They leave scars in records, journals, newspapers, church logs, shipping manifests, insurance claims. They change language. They create myths. They reshape borders. And yet, when we look back at the 19th century, what do we find? An era described as orderly, progressive, industrial, a time of railroads, factories, optimism, and growth. The official story flows smoothly, almost suspiciously so, like a river with no rapids. And that's where the real investigation begins. Because history has a blind spot. It struggles with events that don't fit existing frameworks. Wars can be explained, revolutions can be framed, Economic collapses can be charted, but a planetary-scale disruption that doesn't neatly destroy civilization, only interrupts and reshapes it, is far harder to process. Especially if the people living through it didn't fully understand what was happening themselves. Imagine living in a world where cities are partially buried, climates are unstable, and familiar landscapes no longer behave as expected. You wouldn't call it a global catastrophe. You wouldn't have the language. You'd describe it in fragments. Floods here, bad years there, strange weather, failed crops, massive public works, and over time those fragments would be absorbed into bureaucratic language, neutralized, filed away. This is how large disasters vanish from collective memory. Not through a single act of censorship, but through normalization. Look closely at how 19th century documents describe extraordinary events. Floods that last for months are called seasonal difficulties. Entire neighborhoods being razed by multiple stories are labeled improvements. The removal of hills larger than modern skyscrapers is reduced to regrading. Language becomes a solvent that dissolves shock. And then there's the problem of timing. The mid-19th century sits in a strange gap between eras. It's too recent to be mythical, but too early for modern data collection. Photography exists, but it's rare and curated. Newspapers exist, but they're local, fragmented, and often destroyed. Scientific institutions are still forming. Meteorology is primitive. Seismology barely exists. There is no global system for tracking anomalies. No satellites. No instant communication. A catastrophe that unfolded differently across regions could easily be experienced as disconnected local crises rather than a single global event, especially if it didn't end civilization but forced it to adapt. And adaptation is key here, because the evidence doesn't suggest a world-ending apocalypse. It suggests something subtler and, in many ways, more unsettling. A reset. A disruption that knocked civilization off its trajectory, buried parts of it, and then allowed it to continue forward with amnesia. Think about what happens after a disaster today. Not just the physical rebuilding, but the narrative rebuilding. Governments emphasize resilience, media focuses on recovery. The story becomes about moving on, not about dwelling on vulnerability. Now scale that instinct up to an era when national identity was fragile, when progress was a cultural obsession, when admitting planetary instability could undermine faith in the future. The 19th century was obsessed with progress. Railways crossing continents, telegraph wires shrinking the world, steam engines conquering distance. To admit that nature itself had nearly erased major cities would have been psychologically unacceptable. So instead, the story became one of triumph over terrain. Man mastering nature, cities razed, land tamed, chaos organized, and the buried floors became basements. Once you accept that framing, everything snaps into place. The old ground level isn't discussed because acknowledging it would raise too many questions. Why was it buried? When? By what? And most dangerously, could it happen again? So the evidence is literally built over, forgotten, relegated to architectural oddities, curiosities for tourists. That's just how old cities are. But here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This phenomenon isn't limited to the United States. Similar buried structures appear in Europe, in Asia, in parts of South America. Different climates, different cultures. Same story. Lower floors underground, windows below street level. Official explanations that rely on slow accumulation and urban evolution. Yet the depth and consistency don't align with gradualism. They align with interruption. Which brings us back to the big question we've been circling this entire time. What kind of event could destabilize the entire planetary system enough to produce ice-driven catastrophes in coastal regions, dust-driven catastrophes inland, massive climate anomalies, and widespread burial of human structures, all within a relatively short historical window? We don't know. And that uncertainty is important because pretending to have a neat answer would be dishonest. But we can outline the possibilities. One possibility is a cosmic event. A large asteroid impact doesn't have to hit land to be devastating. An ocean impact could generate massive waves, atmospheric disturbances, and global climate disruption. It could inject dust and vapor into the atmosphere, altering weather patterns for years. Coastal regions would suffer from water and debris. Interior regions would experience drought, wind, and dust. The planet wouldn't end, but it would convulse. Another possibility is extreme volcanism. A series of major eruptions, not just one, could plunge the world into a volcanic winter. Ash in the atmosphere would block sunlight, cool temperatures, kill vegetation, and destabilize weather systems. Glaciers could advance temporarily. Storm patterns could intensify. Wind erosion could strip exposed land. Again, different regions would suffer in different ways, or it could be something we haven't fully identified yet. A complex interaction between solar activity, magnetic field fluctuations, tectonic shifts, and climate feedback loops. Nature doesn't need a single villain. Sometimes systems fail together. What matters isn't which hypothesis you prefer. What matters is recognizing the pattern. Cities buried rapidly. Massive excavation efforts, strange soil behavior, unusual removal methods, global distribution, and a historical narrative that downplays, reframes, or ignores the implications. At this point, the buried buildings stop being the mystery. They become the evidence. Physical proof that something happened which doesn't comfortably fit into the story we're told about the modern world's smooth ascent. And that's why this topic makes people uncomfortable. Because it challenges a core assumption, that the world we inherited was built through steady progress alone, that modern civilization emerged cleanly from the past. That catastrophe belongs to ancient times, not the doorstep of modernity. But the ground says otherwise. Every buried window is a timestamp. Every subterranean doorway is a question mark. Every excavated photograph is a confession we didn't know we were reading. These structures aren't anomalies, they're survivors. And once you start seeing them that way, you can't unsee it. Cities stop looking solid and permanent. They start looking layered, fragile, temporary, built not on certainty, but on recovery. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can accept the official explanations at face value and treat these details as curiosities. Or we can do what humans have always done when faced with uncomfortable evidence. We can ask better questions. Why do so many cities share the same buried architecture? Why does the timing cluster so tightly around the 19th century? Why do removal methods resemble disaster response more than urban planning? And perhaps most importantly, why does history feel so strangely quiet about something so loud? This isn't about believing in a single theory. It's about recognizing that the past may be far less stable than we assume, that civilization has scars we haven't fully acknowledged, and that progress sometimes means forgetting what nearly destroyed us. If you've made it this far, you already feel it. That sense that something doesn't quite add up, that the world beneath your feet might be telling a different story than the one in textbooks, and that story isn't finished. Because the buried layers are still there, under sidewalks, under streets, under buildings we walk past every day, waiting. So here's the thing, this investigation doesn't end here. We've only scratched the surface. There are other cities, other photographs, other anomalies that deepen this mystery even further. And each one brings us closer to understanding not just what happened, but how history chooses what to remember. Look, if this video changed the way you see the world even a little, if you'll never look at an old building the same way again, then you should subscribe right now. Because this channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden layers of reality, the stories that don't quite fit, the evidence that challenges comfortable narratives. Every week we go deeper into mysteries like this, connecting dots that aren't supposed to connect. Thousands of people are already part of this community, questioning, exploring, and rethinking the past together. And what's coming next builds directly on this investigation. We're going to examine other regions, other timelines, and other signs that suggest the 19th century wasn't the calm bridge to modernity we've been taught. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay curious. Because the greatest secrets of history aren't locked away in ancient vaults. They're right beneath our feet.